Wildlife trade is being driven by global market demand. It's being driven by increasing access to wildlife populations as a result of infrastructure development, deforestation, and also improved global transport networks and economic pathways globally. And it's further fueled by poor governance and corruption in many of the places that we work as well. And due to its complexity and also its typically covert nature, the absolute scale and value of illegal wildlife trade is really challenging to assess. But it's estimated that estimates place it in the top 5 illegal transnational trades alongside arms and drugs. So it's a huge issue. And high value wildlife trafficking is becoming increasingly professional. At its most sophisticated, it can involve international criminal networks. And as with other forms of lucrative illegal trade, this can also have an associated threat of violence, which can undermine human rights, undermine governance, and also have implications for stability. And of course, it also depletes vital resources on which many people depend and which are also important for national development. And it's a really complex challenge, it's rapidly changing, and it's also highly varied. So it's really important to remember that all illegal wildlife trade is not homogenous. It's really context specific. It isn't all serious organised crime. And of course, therefore, the approaches that we take to address this issue needs to be different in each context. Next slide, please. And of course, it isn't just a problem affecting the most charismatic and well-known species, such as tigers and rhinos and elephants. It's also impacting species and derivatives across a whole host. So geckos to slipper orchids, cacti to sturgeon, saiga antelope to European eels. Next slide. And it's also a truly global challenge. So for example, Europe is the largest market for laundered caviar. It's also a key destination for unsustainable trade in live reptiles. And Central Asia, for example, is a key source of live raptor trade going to the Middle East. And I think this trafficking route map is a really nice visual way to just show how it's such a truly global problem. And this is trafficked wildlife products through the air transport sector captured in 3 years. And it really just is a really nice way to illustrate how this is a global problem. It's not associated with particular regions, but is a global issue. Next slide. So what are we doing in response to this? So as you might well be aware, global concern and interest in tackling illegal wildlife trade and wildlife trafficking has really grown significantly in the last 5+ years. And this has included many more resolutions and commitments. So for example, in 2015, the UN General Assembly adopted its first wildlife trafficking resolutions. Between 2014 and 2018, some of you might have been involved. The UK government led a series of international conferences focused specifically on this issue. And the CBD has issued guidance towards a sustainable wild meat sector. And in the most recent IPBES report, direct exploitation of organisms, including illegal extraction to meet both local and global markets, was highlighted as a key driver of ecosystem change. So we're seeing a lot more commitment, a lot more recognition of this as a serious issue. And we're also seeing a greater range of stakeholders being involved. So we've seen engagement from the finance sector, from e-commerce, from the transport sector, and also increasing involvement of the UN Security Council, Interpol and UNODC, recognizing this as a transnational organized crime. Next slide, please. So in line with this, of course, we've also seen increased investment to address illegal wildlife trade. So it's slightly dated now, but a World Bank assessment looking at how much money has been spent to tackle illegal wildlife trade estimated that between 2010 and 2016, over 1.3 billion was invested to tackle this problem. And we're seeing investment in illegal wildlife trade and continuing to grow. There's a number of funding streams that are dedicated to this particular problem, including the UK's Challenge Fund, which has just announced another 7.2 million to address illegal wildlife trade. What I would say, though, is that global policy dialogue and investment has really focused on strengthening law enforcement, And there's been much less emphasis to date on progressing behaviour change, and also looking at community level initiatives to reduce demand and to address drivers of trade. And generally, I'd say there's a lack of evidence and systematic evaluation of interventions to inform policy, to inform action, and make sure we're being really effective and we're learning from what we're doing. And generally, I would say as well, there's just a greater need for creative thinking and for interdisciplinary collaboration to tackle this problem. And this is something that FFI is really working to promote, including building stronger links and learning from criminologists, which is what we're going to talk about today. Next slide, please, Sarah. So just briefly to touch on how FFI is approaching this problem. So FFI's Wildlife Trade Initiative was established in 2015. We now have over 40 projects across the globe directly addressing unsustainable or illegal wildlife trade. And very broadly, we talk about the focus of this work in 3 different areas. So we look at preventing crime at source through support for improving site-based protection, promoting community-led guardianship and stewardship, and also building collaborative law enforcement and prevention. Then beyond the site level, we talk about building capacity and leadership at local, national, and international regional levels to strengthen legislation, to improve enforcement and increase prosecution success and make sure it's an actual deterrent for wildlife crime. And then the third area is influencing policymakers, governments, consumers and corporations to help prioritise wildlife crime, to strengthen policy and its implementation, and to address key drivers of illegal trade such as demand for turtle products, for instance. Next slide. So just to whiz you very quickly through an example from each of our regional programmes. So in Central Asia, FFI is tackling illegal hunting and trade of Saiga antelope in the Uster Plateau, which straddles Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. We have extended a sniffer dog initiative to deter and detect illicit trafficking of Saiga, snow leopard and Seka falcon at borders. And we're really working to promote transboundary coordination and cooperation between enforcement agencies and engaging authorities and prosecutors to prioritise wildlife crime. And we're now stepping this up at a regional level to build on this work, working with authorities and local partners across Tajikistan, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And then drawing from criminology, we're now also looking at trade in steppe tortoise in Central Asia with a view to applying situational crime prevention to help reduce this trade. Next slide, please. And building on research already completed in partnership with criminologists, we're now also applying evidence-based situational crime prevention in Pumat National Park in the Annamites in Vietnam. Here, FFI and our partners are working to reduce illegal activity based on a comprehensive crime prevention strategy, including community guardianship and targeted engagement of youth and women. Next slide, please. And FFI has also been working with the Liberian government and civil society partners to build capacity to address wildlife trade at a national scale, including developing a national action plan and a national task force. And we're now also working to better understand, in particular, pangolin presence, distribution and trade, and again, drawing on criminology and social sciences to research trade and to design interventions. Next slide, please. And then finally, I just wanted to mention our work in Nicaragua. So since 2002, FFI has been working to stem poaching, trade and consumption of marine turtles and their eggs on the Pacific coast of Nicaragua. So more than 98% of Nicaragua's hawksbill and leatherback turtle nests on globally important nesting beaches are now protected, but there's still demand internationally and domestically for products made from shell and for eggs. So building on consumer research, drawing on behavioural sciences, social marketing and using qualitative approaches, we're now implementing the first evidence-based and targeted behaviour change strategy to target consumers of marine turtle eggs and shell, aiming to reduce the trade-driven threat further. Next slide. So that's me for the introduction. Thanks ever so much again. I'm now going to hand over to Sarah. So Sarah Gluszek is a criminologist. She's also FFI's Senior Technical Specialist for Wildlife Trade, and she's leading on our work on situational crime prevention in the Wildlife Trade Initiative. Over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rebecca, and hello everyone from whatever parts and time zones of the world you're joining. It's lovely to have so many of you on here today. So I just really wanted to start by saying the introduction that Rebecca gave with what we know about the illegal wildlife trade within wildlife crime has been studied, historically by those working within conservation. And there's a lot of insights we can also get by pulling on criminological approaches and tools to better understand criminal behavior. It's something that's been studied over decades to try and understand, why do people commit crime, where is crime committed, and ultimately, how can we stop and prevent it? So there are several approaches, some of which have already been started to be, looked at within the context of the illegal wildlife trade. But there's just a few that I'm going to touch upon today to give you a bit of background of where we are with this toolkit that we've been developing internally. So if we just think about from the criminological perspective, what is illegal activity, what is wildlife crime? And this requires three actors to be involved. You've got your motivated individual. They're generally rational and they would generally want to undertake the illegal activity. You've got your target species, whether that is fauna, flora, fungi species, and we can also understand from criminology how they are chosen, why was one target chosen over the other. And then you would have your capable guardian or the absence of that capable guardian. Now, when I say a guardian, this could be somebody that looks after and manages the species. So this could be like a protected area manager or the place where this happens. But it can also be a guardian of your motivated individual. So this could be an influential person in somebody's life, such as, a community leader, a family member, someone that would have some sort of impact on that person. And illegal wildlife trade or wildlife crime will happen when you've got that individual coming across the target wildlife species and there is no suitable and appropriate capable guardian in place. And this can happen across time and space. So what else can we do is we can often look at, yes, okay, so the wildlife crime has happened. This is where even further to understand what even enables the crime to happen in the first place. So we can see what has happened before the crime, for example, getting the tools, the information about your wildlife movements, finding your, even, up to finding your buyers, all the planning, preparation and recruitment. And what happens afterwards, how are people, smuggling things out, how are they able to hide it and take it, and also through to that final sale. So by understanding and breaking down these dynamics of crime, what happens before and after, as well as the crime itself, we can then design better interventions to target the problem. To break this down even further, at each of those stages, we can also look at the different people that are involved at any point in this trade, the different places, and of course, the different times. When I say times, this could be, the different times of the day, week, seasonality, years. It could also be situational. So, during the COVID pandemic, that's, another specific time and can help us understand when wildlife crime will happen. And also, if we then focus on places specifically, I mentioned you have the places where the crime happens. But then there are also places where people might convene to do the planning. So in a similar way that we might traditionally think about people networks and criminal networks and how they're working, we can also explore the idea of place networks. And that is, what role do specific places have in facilitating the crime beyond where, the illegal harvest or killing takes place, or even the illegal trade and sale. And so here you can see you've got the public settings. So that could be routine public meeting places where people come together and meet. It could be your private spaces. that, allow people to plan, in their homes or private, WhatsApp groups. It can be virtual or online. They're virtual or in person. And you also have your corrupting spots, which will be places that actually encourage illegal activity to happen for somebody else. For example, you can think about a Facebook group where people talk about wanting a certain species, and someone will come across that, and then they might be encouraged to then go off and engage in legal activity because of that Facebook group. And of course, we also have a lot of information that's been researched by the UN Office of Drugs and Crime with the 2020 World Wildlife Crime Report. It's a very long report which gives us a lot of insights into wildlife crime, but more specifically, it also reflects and tries to reflect where some of those financial elements occur along the illegal wildlife trade supply chain, and showed that actually, a lot of the money that it's made, a lot of the money behind wildlife crime happens within, the later stages at the intermediary level, or at the very end to those people that are buying. So this is just to say that this gives us a nice insight to understand that, where we are applying and thinking about interventions, we need to think about, okay, where should we be focusing our efforts? For example, where is most of the financial transaction happening? And when we think about our enforcement efforts, maybe we might want to go beyond seizure, so beyond, just catching the poachers at the beginning, or just that initial chain, and think beyond the crime, where the crime happens, where it's facilitated, whether that's facilitated financially or just to, at the later stages. And then if we want to also just understand the people elements a little bit better within wildlife crime, there have also been really useful categorizations of typologies within IWT. So Phelps et al. Provided a useful terminology of the different types of people that are harvesting, and then those intermediaries involved in illegal wildlife trade. There's also a really lovely breakdown of consumers by Thomas Walters, which describes the different types of consumer segments. But on top of that, from criminology, we've also explored motivation-based typologies. And now this just adds just an additional perspective by summarizing the different motivations behind offending in the first place. So it's not focused on the motivations behind purchasing or species selection, but why specifically people might be motivated to engage in something that is considered illegal by their local, national, or international laws. And again, you may have heard, talking about organized criminal groups and how they're connected to the illegal wildlife trade. But from criminology, again, this can be broken down to say that, there are different types of criminal groupings of people involved in wildlife crime. So, the ones that we're potentially most familiar with are the organized crime groups. They have, a high level of organization, corruption, sometimes violence as well. They may use violence to get their illegal goods, or behind, to get people involved. They're behind corruption. So we have an example here, such as the caviar trade in Romania and the Caspian Sea. But actually not all of legal activity that we might see is due to organized criminal groups. So you have those disorganized criminal networks. So this is just to say when there are people involved, but it's in a much less structured, doesn't necessarily employ violence as a tool type of way. And potentially in the same way as organized crime groups might be very territorial where they work, these groups are not necessarily connected in one cohesive grouping. So it's very disorganized, but there are connections being made at much smaller scale, much less organized scale. And then finally, we also have our corporate criminal groupings, which are legitimate legal institutions that are, through their interest in their legal means, are laundering protected species and, adding to the illegal wildlife trade. So we have, for example, the laundering of timber or songbirds into the legal trades that were harvested illegally. And finally, I just want to touch upon the buzzword of corruption. Often we might think, when we think about corruption, what does this involve? What does this mean? Really, it might come down to just thinking, it's financially driven, or there's a lot of greed behind those activities. But again, we can get some insights from criminology to just say this can be broken down. There are lots of different reasons and types of corruption, which could be explored further. And if we understand these types better, ideally we can, create and target our interventions to be focused on those specific things, and just to understand that there are different reasons, and not all of them are necessarily negatively driven reasons why people might be involved in corruption. Now, knowing all of this, criminology can help us paint a more comprehensive picture of wildlife crime, because the study of crime has been going on for decades, and this can be applied into our context in conservation. But further than that, there have also been responses in criminology that have been designed to tackle and prevent other types of crime, and there's learning from that we can take to apply in our sector here. First and foremost of this is the theory of deterrence, the theory and practice of deterrence, which is to say, when there are interventions that are designed to get people to stop doing what they're doing, or stop repeating doing what they were doing that was illegal. Deterrence is the idea that if somebody sees a punishment or is punished for a particular crime, they won't recommit or commit in the first place that crime. There are different reasons behind punishing somebody. Deterrence is one of those, to get them to stop. Some of our reasons might be just retaliation or rehabilitation, or to restore what happened, such as with restorative justice. But in terms of whether somebody actually stops, that will blend into the theory of deterrence, which tells us that an individual will stop engaging in illegal activity when they perceive the punishment to be certain, to be swift, and to be severely proportional to the illegal activity that they've engaged in. Now, in conservation, when we're addressing the illegal wildlife trade, often we look to have more serious and tougher punishments or prison sentences for those people engaged in the illegal wildlife trade. And that's, looking at these three elements, that generally just utilizes the severity. So that is just thinking, if we make it more severe, people will stop. But it doesn't consider the first two, certainty and swiftness. And actually, there's been some research from the crime sector that's shown that most often, in terms of effectively deterring people, it is that certainty of punishment that is the most effective factor of these three to get people to stop engaging in illegal activity. And on top of all of this is not just that it is more certain, but they believe it to be more certain. So people are obviously will make decisions based on their own perceptions. So it's really important to also consider their decision making behind risk. And just also to mention that when we do consider punishment and stopping people, this isn't just necessarily the formal punishment that we may be more familiar with, which can be, formal warnings, fines, up until imprisonment or worse in some countries. But there are also informal ways that someone is punished for their illegal behavior. And that can be being ostracized by their families, excluded from certain places. In the conservation context, this could be somebody that's excluded, who's a vendor of illegal products and is excluded from a marketplace because they were trading illegally. We've seen it, the judgment from the community, that second point, we've seen that increasingly so in social media with the cancel culture that might have been seen, where consumers are choosing not to engage with people that have undesirable behavior and not to buy from them or not to travel to certain countries. And if we take a look at just the penal section, so just that formal level of punishment and what we understand by that from within its application in other types of crime, is we've generally seen, if we think about our illegal wildlife trade chain, we've seen that punishments, again, might be implemented inconsistently, potentially more so at those people illegally harvesting wildlife products or illegally killing wildlife products. And we've seen this in non-wildlife crime examples where there are people of more ethnic minorities seen in prisons. It's been seen across, judicial systems across the world. So, in Brazil, in India, in the US, in China, people of different socioeconomic backgrounds might be unfairly or more so punished than other groupings of people. And this has an impact. So the reason I want to explore just the impact that severe punishment can have is just a question that if we are promoting a certain approach or intervention in conservation, we need to be aware of what are the negative consequences of our impacts. And also increasingly so, there should be a consideration, to know, well, are our interventions working as they currently are? And if they're not, we need to consider, okay, what are the consequences? What are these unintended or intended consequences that punishment can have on an individual, on their families, and on societies? So if we look at an individual level, it might seem a little bit obvious. The individual is imprisoned, that they've lost their liberty, they lost their ability to see their families. But in some countries, this can be, even increasingly unethical, where prisons might be overcrowded, they might suffer from poor sanitary conditions or food shortages. And then obviously when that individual is taken away from their families, potentially if they were a main provider, that reduces a family's income, their stability, and actually, it will disrupt that social fabric behind the community. And it impacts societies on a grander level, on national, regional levels, because of the cost of imprisonment and actually the maintenance of those prisons in a safe way, which is not always possible in some countries. And some evidence has actually shown, some research from other types of crime, that where there is severe penal punishment applied to individuals involved in illegal activity, that has actually seemed to increase offending. So it's had the opposite effect. If the intention of punishment is to get people to stop, research has suggested it's actually had the opposite. Not only that it hasn't necessarily been working, but it has increased criminality, mainly because individuals that go into prisons, they now are establishing their identity, their criminal identity. It's being reinforced just by being in prison. They're improving their networks whilst they're in prison. They might also not want to go back into prison if they're released, which could, lead to, and has been seen to lead to more and more serious types of criminal activity to avoid being detected and going back into prison. So there are examples of ex-offenders killing witnesses just not to go back into prison. And there's been some research as well carried out. There are 2 studies by Traffic in Namibia and in South Africa, and also by Powdell in Nepal. Really, really interesting. They went and interviewed prisoners to try and get some insights into why those people were involved in the illegal wildlife trade. And I won't go into detail, but overall what those studies have shown is that, even in our sector with wildlife offences, most of those people in prison are those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, marginalised or indigenous communities. And so we need to think about, that as a UNODC report, those that are most involved financially speaking, or just all the, other players involved in the illegal wildlife trade, and then those that are actually imprisoned and punished for the illegal activity. And again, if we're thinking about those that we've seen that have been imprisoned, we need to also consider, is this working? Is this, is the actual imprisonment and punishment working? in line also with the harm that is caused to themselves, their families, and society on a broader scale. And so there have been some alternative sanctions that have been, suggested, applied, explored in criminology that look instead, for example, informal sanctions rather than those formal penal sanctions, such as reintegrative shaming, which looks at empowering those individuals that have committed illegal activity to confront what they've done, and then to encourage them to actually get back into society and become a law-abiding citizen. And there are some others here really interesting if you do want to follow up about it. I'll only talk about situational crime prevention because it's the one that we're focusing on in our toolkit. But what I really would love to highlight here is that we need to, when we're looking at addressing the illegal wildlife trade, we need to be honest about our intentions. Are we trying to reduce the crime or reduce the harm caused? Are we trying to restore justice, or are we trying to retaliate? And as long as we can be honest about our interventions, we can better choose what approaches we're taking. And very quickly, I do want to actually talk about the WILD project by the Lancaster Environment Centre, which explored the concept of restorative justice and how that can look like in the wildlife crime concept. And what they did was to explore what would be the equivalents in wildlife crime. And restorative justice, essentially what this says is, okay, we've got our original system of humans and nature coexisting, and then there is some sort of harm caused because a species was taken or killed from that natural environment. And often when we then do, say, catch somebody and put them in prison, that harm system still exists. That species is still not in the environment, and very often, even if they're taken alive, they can't be put back in. And so restorative justice, what it does instead is looks at, okay, what was the harm that was caused in the first place, and how can we remedy that directly? So that's to say, what could you do to remedy that harm? So say the harm that was caused was to the local environment, you've now reduced the chances that a critically endangered species is going to survive. So what you would do is you would get somebody to be involved in increasing that conservation area or working directly with conservation efforts in the area, as a small example. And so here I come to situational crime prevention, which is to say, where restorative justice looks at remedying the harm caused, situational crime prevention tries to prevent that harm being caused in the first place. And once we know what the specific harm, so the illegal activity that we're trying to focus on is, we can then design interventions very, very specifically to what is happening and to that specific context, to try and understand and design interventions that will prevent the illegal activity happening. And so very, very broadly speaking, this is when you're looking at that person in the middle, that is the motivated individual that wants to engage in legal activities and they have the opportunities to, it is looking at and finding interventions that will increase effort. So it will make it harder for them to engage in legal activity. It will make it riskier for them to engage. They'll get less benefits from it. Potentially they might not be provoked or prompted to engage in that illegal activity, and they won't have any excuses. And I don't mean excuses in the sense of, oh, I didn't, I have an excuse that I committed an illegal activity, but realistically, maybe not knowing that here is where the protected area starts, or this law applies in this context, just, to remove all of the uncertainty around the illegal activity. And that leads me to introduce the situational crime prevention toolkit that we've been developing in FFI, which we've been working very collaboratively with criminologists and conservation practitioners to apply the theory and the practical application and learning from the crime sector, to adapt the language into our context and into the illegal wildlife trade context, and to design this toolkit that gives guidance through from understanding your targeted illegal activity, all the things that I mentioned from before the crime happens, during and after, all the people and the places involved. And then within this, once you know that understanding, our toolkit then provides guidance into how you can design interventions using these. There are 25 different techniques from within situational crime prevention that can be applied. And we are taking this toolkit forward and piloting it in some of our FFI sites. So we're piloting it to prevent the illegal capture of yellow-naped parrots in Ambatepe in Nicaragua, to prevent the illegal collection of steppe tortoise in Central Asia, which Rebecca already mentioned, the illegal wild meat trade of chimps coming from Liberia, and looking at preventing that too. And finally, also to prevent the illegal shooting of the northern white-cheeked gibbons in Pumat in Vietnam. And our goals and aims around these pilots are for us to get an opportunity to actually test situational crime prevention in the context of the illegal wildlife trade, and to learn from the experiences of applying the toolkit, but experiences, for us to learn from, see, what's working, what isn't working, how can we think about the problems in a different and innovative way, and to then evaluate those interventions so that we can, share that approach more broadly, and hopefully that this toolkit will be publicly available, and to share that more widely to get more people to test out this approach and think about the crime problem from a crime perspective, and start rolling out and saying, okay, can we monitor what is working, and then replicating what does work and learning from what doesn't work. And this toolkit will be available on the FFI website and the problem-orientated policing websites in a month's time, and will be available in English, Spanish, French, and Russian, and available for everybody to use. And the idea is for all that learning to within our conservation community to see how we can help one another, and to apply approaches from social sciences and specifically from criminology. And that's all from me. Thank you very much for listening. Are there any questions? Is there anyone that wants to start applying this toolkit once they get once it's published?
We've got a question here from Aristo, Sarah, in the chat. He's asking, could you tell us a bit more about the SCP methods?
Sure, yes. So I haven't gone into detail here because we've spent a lot of time to try and simplify the approaches and the language in a logical process within the toolkit, so it'll be much clearer there. But essentially what SCP does is try to understand the opportunities. So why is somebody able to target this particular species from this area, or trade it in this area, or smuggle it across this particular border? So where do those opportunities exist? And then to design those 5 areas of making it harder, riskier, less rewarding, and so on for a person to engage. And the easiest way I can try to explain this in non-crime terms is, imagine if you've gone into a bus station, say, and then you see there's some money on the ground. Now, are you going to pick it up? Just say generally you might be motivated to pick it up if you see money. I mean, it's great, free money. You see it on the ground. Now, that money is right next to a bench full of people and they're looking at you. Are you still going to pick it up because those people are watching you now? Or just say that money is of a really low value. Is it worth the effort to bend all the way down and pick up the money? But then again, what if it's, it's a note, it's like £1 million, $1 million, are you going to pick it up? Or, you go down and you find that it's glued to the ground. Are you going to take the time and the effort to go and buy like a tool to scrape it off of the ground? And so SCP sort of looks at this, the immediate situation around you to see, okay, what decisions do people make in the moment and why, and how can we influence their decisions in the moment and to nudge them in the direction of they won't do it. They won't pick up the coin now. They won't take, kill, or trade that illegal wildlife species. So it's around that, but it's obviously a lot more comprehensive, but we've tried to explain that as simply as we possibly could in the toolkit.
Thanks, Sarah. I might just add to that as well, that when you're, so that's the applying situational crime prevention and all the theory and learning from decades of crime prevention in other sectors, but also in order to design crime prevention strategy, you have to, or it's recommended that you do a process called crime scripting, where you describe, all of, not just the moment of the crime, which is what we tend to focus on. We tend to focus on the scene of the crime, the moment an elephant is slaughtered, for example, but it makes you think about every aspect that's involved. So you think about through preparation, through to the crime, and then realizing the benefit from the crime, and there'll be multiple steps involved. So, to poach an elephant, you'd need to for example, hire a motorbike, hire equipment, find a safe house to store the ivory in later. There's so many different aspects to successfully carrying out that crime. And so what this process helps you do is think about all of the timeline, but all of the people involved, all of the places involved, thinking again creatively, like Sarah talked about the convergent settings and the corrupting spots, and not just about the scene of crime. So you're just thinking more laterally about who's involved, the times involved, the places involved, and where those pinch points might be, where you can put some pressure and just make every step a little bit more difficult to undertake. And that also perhaps begins to address Vicky's question. Thanks, Vicky. What we hope is that obviously there's a huge kind of gap in data around gender and who's involved in wildlife crime. And what I hope is that because we're thinking about this whole timeline and we're thinking about all the intermediaries, so who's involved, not just in the poaching, but also the processing, the logistics, everything, that actually some of the gender aspects will become more visible, and then we can be much more targeted with our interventions. But please do say if I haven't answered your question. Thank you for it.
We have another question as well from Thomas Jasper. He asks, how can people be nudged away from illegal wildlife trafficking without having substantive resources to provide alternatives?
Yeah, so I will just use a very small example, non-wildlife crime based, just to give a bit of perspective that it's not, the nudging doesn't have to be necessarily resourcing police effort, patrol efforts, or border patrols or whatever it may be with a trafficker, but it could just be making it more visible. So in a non-wildlife crime context, this is where, just say there's violent crime happening in a certain area, you might think, okay, put police there, put security guards there so it doesn't happen. But something that, an alternative, and thinking about that, more creatively, could be to make sure that area is well lit. Much cheaper to pay for lighting than it is to pay for people to, control that area. And so we're not nudging their motivations away, if that's what you're referring to by alternatives, but we're nudging away the opportunity for them to engage in crime. So just, thinking that if they're generally rational, they're going to think about the costs, the benefits, the risks and the rewards involved before they engage. The nudging away is to nudge them away to make that decision here, because they will get caught, they will be seen, there is a risk involved, and in that sort of way, if that answers the question.
Thank you, Sarah. I have a quick question. Do you have any plans about how you're going to, once you roll out the toolkit and people start using it, do you have any plans about how you're going to monitor the effectiveness of it, what kind of effect it's having?
Yeah, absolutely. So within the toolkit, we start introducing some, monitoring, evaluation and learning, and we suggest that people that are applying the toolkit, and our sites included, share learning about the process, how it's gone, how we found it, but also then, with very specific indicators to see, okay, has this reduced crime in our very targeted context? And there are examples of the application of situational crime prevention that we'll be drawing on when we are doing this, but from other types of crimes that have been monitored and evaluated by process and also by the outcome of what's happened, that have looked at evaluating what's worked. And there is a lot of information and evidence out there that says this does work. It has worked in international contexts. It's worked in the Netherlands with reducing the illegal trafficking of ecstasy. It's worked in the US with reducing violent crime in the streets. It's worked with very serious crime. And so, within wildlife crime, we can also, apply the same sort of thinking and, evaluation tools that have been used by criminologists. And that's what we'll be doing. Again, Rebecca popped it in the chat, but and thank you to Aristo for pointing out the POP Center. So that's one of the places where as well as our website, where our toolkit will be hosted. And we're working with the editors of the POP Center board behind the Wilderness Problems page.
Oh, it looks like we've got another quick question from Carly in the chat. Thanks, Carly. So Carly's asking, how should someone new in the field of conservation get involved?
Thanks, Carly. So when this toolkit is available, hopefully perhaps we can send it through the CLP networks and share it, and we hope it will be really accessible. We've tried to translate some quite difficult concepts into really accessible language and kind of breaking it down into steps. But if you're interested in learning more, then please feel free to get in touch with Sarah or I. We'd be happy to talk to you further. And thanks, Vicky, also for your interest. Also Aristo's asked me a question separately that perhaps we can just touch on around so situational crime prevention. It's obviously you're collecting research and you're collecting information, and you have to do that in an ethical, open way. And some of it might be sensitive and you need to make sure you manage that responsibly. But what situational crime prevention does not do, it doesn't seek to profile an individual. So it's all about the situation and the context and how you can influence that and manipulate that at different points in time and different places, and thinking, and it's very evidence-based, so it helps you be creative, but it's not about kind of profiling particular individuals who might be more prone to undertaking crime. But again, if any of you have any questions or you'd like to dig a little bit deeper, then please do reach out and we'll try and find a time over the next couple of months, or perhaps after the toolkit's available, and be really happy to talk to you more.
Thanks, Rebecca. It would be fantastic if we could share the toolkit once it is launched with the alumni network. That'd be brilliant.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Thanks. Are there any other questions at all for Sarah and Rebecca before we close this webinar? We've got a couple more minutes left, so please fire away if you have any burning questions. Otherwise, yeah, feel free to get in touch with Sarah and Rebecca directly. Okay. Doesn't look like we have any more questions at all. So I think now is a time to, oh, we've just got one question quickly. Would you be able to share the link to the toolkit? So I think we'll be sharing it. And I think, Sarah, you mentioned it would be available openly on the FFI website, is that right?
On the FFI website and also the POP website. There was a link shared there, so there's a section that will go on there, but we can share it around with the alumni network.
Yeah. Well, very much look forward to seeing the toolkit when it's launched. I think in a month's time, didn't you say? The 1st of December?
We're hoping, yes.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Yeah, best of luck with that, with the launch. And yeah, I'd just like to say on behalf of CLP and the network, thank you so much to Rebecca and Sarah for taking the time today to come and give this wonderful webinar. I, for one, found it absolutely fascinating and such a brilliant toolkit to have. And yeah, like I said, best of luck with rolling it out and seeing some great outcomes coming out of it.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and thanks very
Thanks,
much for the
everyone.
invite again. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Bye.